I used to work night shifts at a pediatric hospital in Central Oregon, a squat, aging building that clung to the edges of the valley like it didn't quite want to be seen. Most of the time it felt like a safe enough place. Busy, sterile, full of soft murmurs and the mechanical hum of machines doing their nightly duty. But there was something about the fourth floor that never quite sat right with any of us who worked nights. Officially, the fourth floor was divided. The east wing held the NICU, where I worked most nights, and the west was home to the old oncology unit, mostly empty now, with only a handful of long-term pediatric patients ever admitted. It had a reputation among the night crew, a quiet kind of whisper that settled in your gut. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened out there after midnight. Most of us chalked it up to stress or sleep deprivation. Working 12-hour night shifts will do strange things to your sense of reality. I didn't pay much attention to the rumors until that one night in early autumn. I remember the chill that had started to creep into the air, and how the parking lot lights outside cast long shadows across the empty halls. It was one of those 3 a.m. stretches where the world feels suspended in thick stillness. I was dead tired, but still had a few hours left, and I needed coffee like my life depended on it. The cafeteria was down on the second floor, and the fastest way there was through a side stairwell at the far end of the oncology wing. Most nights I would avoid that route altogether, even if it meant a longer walk. But that night, I thought, screw it. I'd never seen anything unusual, and I wasn't in the mood to be superstitious. Just caffeine and back 5 minutes tops. So I headed out through the NICU, past the dimly lit nurses' station, and pushed through the set of heavy motorized double doors that separated our wing from oncology. The lights in the hallway beyond were on but dimmed low, casting everything in this faint bluish haze. The tile floor seemed unusually clean, like they'd just been waxed, and the air had that faint chemical tang of disinfectant mixed with something else, older, mustier, like an empty room that hadn't seen sunlight in too long. As I stepped through, the doors closed behind me with a soft hiss. The quiet hit me instantly. No murmuring monitors, no footsteps, just this low electrical hum from overhead lights. And then I saw him. A child, no more than 6 or 7 maybe. He was skipping gently down the hallway away from me. Not in any rush. His feet barely made a sound against the floor. He wore striped pajama pants and a faded green t-shirt that looked too big for his small frame. His head was shaved, and the skin on his arms looked pale and slightly translucent in the bluish light. I remember thinking immediately that he must have slipped out of one of the patient rooms, which was a terrifying thought considering the state most of the kids were in. I took a step forward and called out, "Hey, wait, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here." He stopped mid-skip, perfectly still, then turned his head. It was a small motion, no dramatic whip around, no jump scare, just a slow pivot until his face was looking over his shoulder at me. His expression was blank, not scared, not playful, not angry, just watching. And then he blinked and vanished. Not ran off, not slipped behind a corner, just gone. The hall in front of me was empty. All the doors were closed. There was nowhere he could have gone. For a moment, I stood there trying to make sense of it. I told myself it was the lighting, that maybe he had ducked into a shadow, or maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. It wasn't unheard of. I was tired, maybe even a little dehydrated. I just needed caffeine. But I didn't take the stairwell that night. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on that hall, and retreated through the double doors. I took the long way down to the cafeteria, through the main elevators on the opposite side of the floor, even though it added another 5 minutes. When I returned with my coffee, I walked around the oncology wing completely. A few days later, I brought it up offhandedly with one of the senior nurses who'd worked nights even longer than I had. Her expression didn't change. She just nodded slightly and said, "Yeah, people see him sometimes, skipping, never talks, just watches." Apparently, I wasn't the first. Some say he was a long-term patient in that unit years ago. Others think he never really existed at all. Just an echo, or something worse. Whatever the case, I never took that shortcut again, not once. There's something deeply unsettling about seeing a child like that, not afraid, Not sad, but just empty. Like he doesn't belong anywhere anymore, but something keeps him circling that hallway, endlessly skipping through a place that forgot how to let go. It happened during a night shift I'll never forget. The hospital was unusually still, the kind of quiet that presses into your skin. Even the overhead lights seemed more subdued, flickering slightly in some corners of the hallway, like they weren't sure if they should stay on. I was working the overnight round in one of the general care wings, assigned to a patient I'd cared for a few times before. He was an older gentleman, soft-spoken, always polite, but very ill. There had been a slow decline in his condition over the past few days, and although he hadn't been deemed critical, there was a heaviness in the air around his room. Around 2:40 a.m., I walked into his room to check his vitals. The only sound was the steady beeping of the monitors and the low mechanical hum of the hospital's central systems that seemed to run beneath everything like a nervous system. The blinds were halfway drawn, letting in a slice of orange light from the street lamp outside. I greeted him softly. No response. He was still. Too still. I moved closer, watching his chest for any movement. Nothing. My hand instinctively reached out to touch his shoulder. Cold. I did a full assessment and quickly called for assistance. We attempted resuscitation, compressions, oxygen, the whole protocol, but nothing worked. Time of death was called not long after. I stood in the room for a few moments afterward, helping tidy up and finish the required paperwork. The room had gone eerily silent again. It always amazed me how still the world gets in the presence of death, like time is respectfully holding its breath. Once everything was logged, I left the room and made my way toward the back hallway where the break room was. That hallway was always oddly quiet, with no windows and soft overhead lights that made everything feel a little more distant. I was halfway down when it happened. A hand. I felt fingers graze the inside of my right forearm. Not a brush, not a bump, but a touch. Firm and cold, like someone had reached out with intention. I stopped walking instantly. My body went stiff, and for a second, I genuinely thought I might faint. I turned my head sharply, but the hallway was empty. There was no one behind me. No sound, no movement, just that dull electrical hum in the walls. At first, I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that it was stress or fatigue, maybe a stray fiber from my scrubs shifting, but that didn't make sense. The feeling was too clear. I knew what skin-on-skin contact felt like, and this had been unmistakable. I brought my hand to the spot where I'd felt it. My skin was cool. And then I noticed the goosebumps. I stood there, caught in a weird in-between state. Too afraid to keep walking, too shaken to go back. I finally pulled myself together and made it to the break room, where one of the nurses on call noticed my face and asked what was wrong. I just shook my head and sat down. I couldn't even speak yet. Later that morning, I found myself going back over every second of that hallway walk. I tried to explain it away in every logical way I could think of. Exhaustion, maybe a static charge, or even a hallucination caused by stress. But none of it stuck. I had seen the man die. I'd watched the monitor flatline. I'd helped zip the body bag. But something about that touch felt deliberate, almost like a final goodbye, or worse, like someone wasn't quite ready to leave yet. I've worked many night shifts since then. I've seen more deaths than I can count, but that single moment still hangs with me like a shadow I can't step out of. I've never told the full story to anyone, until now. Maybe someone out there has experienced something like it, or maybe it was just me. All I know is this: when the dead reach out to you, even once, something in you never feels entirely alone in the dark again. I worked the night shift at a nursing home in eastern Kentucky for close to 6 years, splitting my time between CNA work and eventually, once I got my license, working as an LPN. It wasn't a huge facility, just a medium-sized privately owned building nestled behind a patch of pines off a 2-lane highway. Most of the staff had been there for years, and the building carried the weight of decades of use, old wallpaper curling at the edges, the scent of antiseptic never quite covering the damp smell of age and time. Most nights passed slowly and quietly. After the usual rounds, you'd find yourself sitting at the nurse's station with lukewarm coffee, listening to the hum of vending machines or the occasional chime from a call light. But not all nights were like that. I always thought the building was odd. Some corners seemed colder than others, even when the thermostat read just fine. Certain rooms had this heaviness in the air, like the space held something it wasn't ready to let go of. You could explain most of that away with drafts, old plumbing, or just the way the building settled, but some things didn't fit. I remember one night in particular. A resident had passed, a woman in her late 80s who had been declining for weeks. It wasn't sudden, but it still hit harder than expected. She was quiet, kind, and had never once complained. That night, after the paperwork was done and the family had been called, I went in to clean her up, prepare her for the funeral home. The room was still. Her small TV buzzed softly, with static, a signal issue we'd never managed to fix, and the light above the sink flickered, even though the bulb had just been changed. I latched the door shut, not fully out of habit, but because, weirdly, I always felt safer when it was closed during post-mortem care. As I worked, the room stayed quiet, save for the occasional groan of the building. Then, without warning, the door swung open. Not a slow creak. It flung open like someone had yanked it hard from the hallway. I stood completely still, my hands still on the edge of the bed. The hallway beyond was empty. I stared for several seconds, expecting a coworker to step in or maybe apologize for the sudden entry. But there was no one. The corridor lights buzzed low, flickering slightly the way they sometimes did late at night. I stepped to the door and peered down both sides. Not a soul. I closed the door, this time pushing, until I heard the latch click firmly in place. But the moment I turned my back, I heard a light knock behind me. 3 soft taps. I turned back slowly. The door hadn't moved, but the sound had been unmistakable. There was no one outside. I was sure of it. That was the first incident. Things escalated over time. Lights that had been off would flicker on. Once, the hallway outside the medroom lit up fully while I was inside and alone. When I went to check, it dimmed again as I stepped out. Toilets flushed randomly, and not just the automatic ones. We had a few older models in the West Wing, and once I heard one flush 3 times in a row while I was charting. But the one moment that never left me happened about 4 months later. There was a resident, a woman with advanced dementia who rarely spoke in full sentences. But that night during my rounds, I found her wide awake, her eyes fixed on the closet door at the foot of her bed. "Can you shut it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Shut what, sweetheart?" "The closet. She keeps going in and out. I can't sleep. She walks right through it. She stands there, watching." I turned to the closet. The door was open, just slightly, enough to see the dark interior and the few hanging gowns we rotated for her. Nothing out of place. I walked over and pulled it closed, gently, trying not to let her see how uneasy I felt. "There you go," I said softly. "It's shut now." She shook her head. "She's not done. She comes when people are about to go, watches until they do." I didn't know what to say. I made a note to keep an extra eye on her that night, but she was fine. Slept peacefully after that. 2 nights later, though, she passed in her sleep. The same closet door was open when we found her. Since then, I've heard other aides and nurses talk about her. The woman in the closet. Some have seen her reflection in the window at night. One aide swore she saw her walking across the hallway through a closed door. We never talk about it openly, just quiet nods and knowing looks when strange things happen. I don't work there anymore, but sometimes I still think about that room, about that woman who passed, and the door that wouldn't stay shut, about the gentle knock I heard in the dead of night, and the chilling idea that maybe, just maybe, someone was trying to come through. I've worked the night shift in long-term care for years, but there are some nights that still linger with me long after the sun rises. Nights that cling to my thoughts in the quiet moments, long after I've clocked out and driven home in silence. There's one in particular I don't think I'll ever forget. This happened in a memory care facility just outside of Richmond, Virginia. It wasn't a large place, and by the time most of the residents were in their rooms for the night, the halls would quiet down to that eerie stillness that only old buildings seem capable of. We kept the overhead lights dim to help the residents sleep, which made the corridors feel more like tunnels than hallways. The silence was deep enough to hear the creak of every floorboard and the hum of the vending machine down in the break room. It was around 2:45 in the morning when I heard the scream. Not a confused cry or a startled yelp. This was a scream, rooted in real, chest-deep terror, the kind that gets your legs moving before your brain has caught up. I bolted from the nurse's station, heels clicking across the vinyl tile floor, and followed the sound to one of the private rooms at the end of the South Hall. The woman inside, a frail, soft-spoken resident in her late 80s, who usually barely spoke above a whisper, had somehow maneuvered herself into her wheelchair. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and her thin arms were gripping the wheels so tightly that her knuckles looked bloodless. She was sobbing and trying to push herself toward the door when I stepped in. Hey, it's all right, I said, crouching to her level. You're okay. What's going on? What happened? She kept pointing behind me, toward the open door to her room. The fire, she choked out. The building is on fire. Everything is burning. Can't you smell it? I paused. There was no smoke, no alarms, nothing on the control board. But her eyes were wild and desperate, and locked on to something that simply wasn't there. I turned back, looked at the room. The soft light of her bedside lamp spilled across her dresser, casting gentle shadows across the floral wallpaper. Nothing unusual, nothing burning. There's no fire, I said, as gently as I could. You're safe. Look at me, I promise you. There's no fire. But it didn't matter. To her, the fire was real. She could see it, smell it, feel the heat of it licking up the walls. The brain doesn't always distinguish imagination from reality, especially not when it's been worn down by disease. The parts of her mind responsible for fear, for flight, for pain and memory and instinct, those were all still firing, still alive in ways that made her experience as real as my own. I wheeled her out into the hall, away from whatever horrors her eyes still insisted were devouring her room. She kept trembling, and I sat with her for a while in the common lounge, holding her hand, talking to her softly. It took over 20 minutes for her breathing to settle. That wasn't the only time something like that happened. Sometimes the hallucinations were quieter. There were nights when residents would ring the call bell in the small hours, claiming there was someone standing at the foot of their bed. A child, a man, a shadow. One woman, who was usually very composed, once whispered to me as I refilled her water that there was a stranger behind me, watching us both. I turned. Nothing. She asked me, with terrifying sincerity, to escort the man out of her room. Said he was making her nervous just standing there, near the closet. I had to play along. You learn to do that. I opened the closet door, murmured something about escorting the gentleman out, and gently closed the door again. She smiled after that, said thank you, went right to sleep. It's not the ghosts I'm afraid of. It's the look in their eyes when they see something I can't. Something they react to so viscerally, so convincingly, that for a moment I start to doubt my own perception. You question your reality when enough people, night after night, see the same things in the same corners. I've seen doors swing open on their own, lights flickering without explanation, faucets running when no one's touched them. And that closet at the end of Hall C, I always keep it shut. Always. One resident begged me to. She said a woman kept walking in and out of it every night and wouldn't stop staring at her from the doorway. It made her feel watched. I still check that closet every shift. Not because I expect to find anything, but because one day I might. I spent over 5 years working at a long-term care facility. The building itself was nothing special, a squat, gray structure surrounded by a few trees and a cracked parking lot. It always looked a bit sad during the day. At night, though, it took on a different energy altogether. A strange stillness hung over the place once the sun dipped below the hills, the kind of stillness that made you feel like something was just out of sight. I started there as a CNA and eventually trained into an LPN role. Long shifts, a lot of routine work, and the constant low hum of fluorescent lights. Honestly, most nights blurred together. But every now and then, something would happen that snapped me out of the monotony and reminded me just how weird this place could be. We had a hallway that the staff half-jokingly referred to as the cold wing. It wasn't on the HVAC loop like the rest of the building, but even accounting for that, it felt different. The air was always a bit heavier there, thicker. Residents hated it too. Some would ask to be moved, even if it meant a room without a window, and every once in a while someone would mention seeing a little girl. The stories were always the same: short hair, pale dress, sometimes humming. At first I figured it was just something that passed around in conversation, like all workplaces have. A recycled tale, or maybe some resident with dementia whispering something that stuck with the staff. I didn't give it much weight until I started hearing it from people who didn't know each other. New aides, temp nurses, even the residents brought her up, completely unprompted. But my personal experiences weren't quite so visual. Mine were subtle. Things you could rationalize, but that still kept you up. There was a stretch of 2 weeks where the call bell system kept malfunctioning, but not in the way you'd expect. The panel would start blinking and we'd hear the bells, but no corresponding lights showed which room triggered it. We couldn't reset it the normal way either. Someone always had to walk back into the electrical room, this concrete box at the far end of the maintenance hallway, and manually override the system. The first time it happened, I thought it was a fluke. Second time, maybe a bad circuit. By the 6th time in a week, I was getting irritated. I asked our maintenance guy, who had worked there longer than anyone else, if he knew what was going on. He just shook his head and said, "That wing's always been like that. We replace the board, it goes out again. Don't waste your breath." Then there was the plumbing. Faucets would turn on in the middle of the night. Toilets flushed when no one had been in the room for hours. I once walked past an empty bathroom and felt a splash on my shoe. The sink had just turned on. I turned it off, stood there for a minute, and it stayed off. I shrugged it off and kept going. But the door incident is what really stuck with me. I was helping prepare the body of an older woman who had passed quietly in her sleep. She'd been with us for months, and I had gotten to know her pretty well. It wasn't my first post-mortem care, but it was never something I got used to. There's a weight to that kind of work, even after years. I was alone in the room, just doing the routine, gently closing her eyes, making her presentable for her family. The room door was firmly latched. I always made sure of it, especially at night. And then, just as I finished adjusting the sheet over her, the door swung open hard enough to bounce off the wall. I stood there, completely still, waiting for someone to come in. No one did. I walked over, peeked into the hallway. Empty. Checked the hinges. No draft. No reason it should have opened like that. That same night I was on rounds in a different wing, when one of the residents, a quiet woman who didn't say much, called me over. She pointed toward the closet at the foot of her bed and said, "Could you close that door, please? That woman keeps coming in and out of there and it's making it hard to sleep." I looked over. The closet door was barely cracked open, just wide enough to cast a sliver of shadow across the linoleum floor. I closed it slowly, trying not to show her that my hands had started shaking just a little. I asked her what the woman looked like. She just shook her head and said, "She never talks, just looks at me, then goes back in." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, wished her good night, and stepped out of the room. The next morning, one of the aides from night shift mentioned something strange while we were getting coffee. She had been on break, sitting in her car in the staff parking lot, when someone knocked on her window. She said it was a woman in a pale blue dress. When she turned to look more closely, she was gone. What made it worse was what happened later that day. We were chatting about it in the staff lounge during the shift change, just retelling the story when one of the older nurses came in with a box of archived files. She flipped through a few folders, pulled out a photo, and held it up. The staff member who saw the woman in the parking lot went pale. "That's her," she said. "That's the woman who knocked." The photo was dated from more than a decade ago. A resident who had passed away long before any of us current staff had even been hired. Since then, we all carry a quiet unease with us when we walk the halls at night. The stories stopped feeling like stories. I still don't know what I believe exactly, but I know what I've seen, and I know the look in my coworker's eyes when she held that photo in her hands. Some things in that place don't want to be forgotten. I spent over a decade as a paramedic in California, specifically in the eastern part of Oakland, where the nights felt longer than they had any right to, and the city never truly slept. The engine groans, the radio chatter, the flickering of overhead fluorescents inside the rig, they all became part of the soundtrack of my life. I got used to blood, to sirens, to the blur between tragedy and routine. But some nights, something different happens. Something that gets under your skin, in a way that medical training doesn't prepare you for. It was a Thursday, I think, late summer. That kind of dry California heat that clings to your skin even after the sun goes down. My partner and I were stationed near an assisted living complex, just off MacArthur. We got a call around 11:45 p.m. Elderly male, late-stage heart disease, shortness of breath, unstable vitals. We were there within 6 minutes. The man was sitting on the edge of his recliner when we arrived, hunched forward with a calm, resigned look on his face, like he'd already been through the decision in his head and accepted what was coming. His daughter was beside him, holding his hand so tight her knuckles had gone pale. She looked tired, the kind of tired that seeps from the soul. He was frail, probably in his late 80s, dressed in a cardigan and slippers, like he'd been ready for bed. We loaded him into the back of the ambulance, while his daughter climbed into the front passenger seat. She kept turning around every so often, checking on him like a mother watching her child sleep in the rearview mirror. The interior lights in the rig had this dull yellow tint that made everything look sicklier than it already was. It was quiet except for the heart monitor and the occasional shift of tires over uneven asphalt. We weren't far from the hospital, maybe 5 or 6 minutes out. I sat beside him, monitoring his vitals, keeping my notes. Then, without any prompting, he looked up. Not at me, not at his daughter. He turned his face upward, toward the empty back corner of the rig, just above the cabinets that held IV supplies and airway kits. His eyes seemed to soften. The fear that had been there when we picked him up just left his expression. He smiled gently. "It's okay, Lulu," he said in a whispery rasp. "I'll be with you soon." I paused, the pen in my hand hovering over my chart. There was no one else in the back of the rig, just the two of us. The air suddenly felt heavier. Not cold, exactly, just weighted, like the air in a room where someone has been crying for a long time. I leaned in a little, cautiously. "Who's Lulu?" I asked softly. His daughter, who had clearly heard it too, turned her head and spoke through the small sliding window. Her voice cracked. "That was my mother's name. She died 20 years ago." The man didn't speak again. His breath grew slower. Each rise of his chest became shallower, spaced farther apart. I reached for the pulse ox to check the reading, but before I could say anything, the monitor began to beep erratically, then flatlined. I called it out and began compressions, instinct and training taking over. My partner pulled the rig to a halt and joined me in the back. We worked him hard, trying to bring him back, trying every protocol, every shock, every breath. But I think he was already gone before we even started. The way he looked up, that moment of peace in his eyes, still sits with me. After the hospital officially pronounced him, I had to take a few minutes before writing my report. I stepped out behind the ER loading dock and leaned against the wall, trying to steady my hands. I lit a cigarette, my first one in years. The cherry glowed in the dark like a small pulsing eye. I thought about how sometimes in this job, you see things that make you question your own sense of reality. I kept replaying that glance. The way he spoke to the empty corner of the rig, like someone was actually there. And maybe someone was. I've seen people pass in anger, in fear, in confusion, but he went calm. He left with peace. I finished the report that night, detailing vitals, times, efforts, the official stuff. But nowhere in that chart did I write about Lulu. No checkbox for that. But I saw what I saw. And maybe death isn't just a shutting down. Maybe it's also a reunion. It was one of those sticky, hot summer nights in Savannah. The kind where the air feels heavier inside than out. I was halfway through a double shift at the assisted living facility, where I worked as a medtech. I'd done enough late hours there to stop being bothered by creaking pipes or flickering hallway lights. The place was old after all. But that night, something felt. Margaret had passed away just the day before. I wasn't particularly close to her. None of us really were, but she had this gentleness to her, like she never wanted to inconvenience anyone. Her family had come by earlier that afternoon, grief weighing heavy on them, but they didn't take any of her things, not even the pendant she used to call for help, which still sat silently on her nightstand in room 2. Around 10:30 p.m., I was at the medcart restocking, when one of Margaret's neighbors, a sweet but very chatty woman named Lorraine, flagged me down. She said she couldn't sleep. Something about hearing someone talking in the next room, Margaret's room. I looked at her, unsure of how to respond. I nodded gently and reassured her that Margaret's room was locked and empty. She gave me a hesitant smile, but didn't look convinced. An hour passed. The air in the hallway started to feel oddly cold. Not just chilly from the vents, but like walking through the frozen section of a grocery store with wet clothes. Then the call light panel lit up. Room 2. I just stared at it. The pendant system doesn't activate randomly. You have to physically press the button, and only the resident assigned to that room would have access to that pendant. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, just watching the light blink steadily, like a slow heartbeat. Everyone else avoided it. No one said it out loud, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't want to be the one to walk in. I told myself I was being rational, practical, the professional here, so I volunteered. I walked the hallway alone. It felt longer than usual, the lights above casting a sterile white glow on the waxed linoleum. Each footstep echoed a little too loud in the silence. When I got to the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the handle. I expected it to be locked, but it gave way immediately. The second I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold, it was sharp, like breathing in ice. The kind of cold that bites at your fingers and seeps into your joints. I instinctively looked toward the thermostat. The unit was off. I tried to ignore the chill and walked toward the nightstand, where the pendant light glowed softly, blinking. I reached out to reset the system. That's when it happened. From behind me, the bathroom door slammed shut. Not a slow creak, not a gust of wind type nudge. It slammed, hard. It was the kind of slam that makes your body jolt before your brain even registers it. I turned around fast, heart pounding, expecting what? A person? Another staff member playing a prank? There was nothing, just the closed door. I didn't wait. I flipped the lock on the main door, bolted into the hallway, and nearly slipped, rounding the corner back to the nurse's station. My coworker saw the look on my face and didn't even ask, just raised an eyebrow and kept charting, like none of this was surprising. We eventually got one of the older male staff members. He was one of those nothing phases me types to check the room. When he got there, the door was still locked. Everything was in place. The bathroom door, wide open. No one inside. We didn't say much about it after. That room stayed empty for a while longer than it should have, even after housekeeping cleaned it top to bottom. And Margaret's pendant, it got deactivated and placed in the equipment drawer, but every so often, the light on the panel would flicker, just for a moment, then stop. It's strange how some people seem to linger. Not in the loud, obvious ways that movies love to dramatize, but in the quiet ones, in the chill of a room that should be warm, or a door that slams when no one's nearby. I don't scare easily, but that night, something made it clear. Just because a room is empty doesn't mean it's unoccupied.